Good morning, class. This is Mr. Harris with this week's lecture, and we're going to be turning to abnormal psychology for our last mini unit. Unfortunately, because of the way the remote learning done and I'm running out of time, we're not going to be able to get into all of the different ones together as a class. However, our final project will be researching some different elements of abnormal psychology. So let's begin. Now, I put in front of you a series of paintings by an English artist named Lewis Wayne. Okay, Lewis Wayne loved drawing kittens. And if you look at the first one up the upper left-hand corner, it looks like a kitten. So does the next one. And then things start to get a little stranger and stranger, okay? And the cat becomes less cat-like and more abstract, a lot of fractal patterns, some ways maybe even a little more menacing. And these patterns actually look similar to what people describe when they're doing hallucinogenic drugs. However, Lewis Wayne was not doing hallucinogenic drugs. He was struggling with a mental illness. And the mental illness that Lewis Wayne had was called schizophrenia. Okay? And schizophrenia is the most commonly associated with voices talking to you kind of against your will. So hearing voices, a lot of people with schizophrenia become paranoid and think that there's a conspiracy of people out to get them. Obviously, we can see from this painting, it had a lot of other effects on the mind. So I'm going to do a couple true or false questions, okay? In some cultures, schizophrenia and depression are non-existent. False, okay? These disorders are described in all cultures. However, they may be different in each and every culture. In some sub-Saharan African countries, people with schizophrenia report the voices they hear are overwhelmingly positive, while in the United States, the voices people tend to hear are overwhelmingly negative, okay? So culture does affect mental illness, but we see it in every different culture. The more contact people have with individuals with disorders, the less accepting their attitudes are. False. Okay. The more time you spend around people with mental disorders, you begin to accept them and to understand them better. About 30% of people who are psychologically disordered are dangerous. They're more likely than others to commit a crime. That is false. People with mental illnesses are in danger of having crimes committed against them because they often don't report them. In our country, unfortunately, a lot of our homeless population has mental illness, and many of them will not report crimes for fear of reprisals from police officers or the people that committed crimes against them. Research indicates in the United States there are more prison inmates of severe mental disorders than there are psychiatric inpatients in all the country's hospitals. That is true. We are not doing a great job with mental illness in our country, and people that are mentally ill and violent or can't live in society tend to get locked up in prison and not necessarily in a mental hospital. We don't have as many as those as we used to in the past. Identical twins who have been raised separately sometimes develop similar phobias. That is true. And if you guys watch the documentary, Three Identical Strangers, you can see how many things those guys had in common despite being raised separately. Okay. Dissociative identity disorder is a type of schizophrenia. They are two separate disorders. And this one is very, very controversial. This is sometimes called multiple personality disorder. Is that real? You guys can research about that. In North America, today's young adults are 3 times more likely than their grandparents that report having suffered depression. That is true. Anxiety rates and depression rates, as reported by people, are going through the roof. White Americans commit suicide nearly twice as often as black Americans do. That is true. Unfortunately or fortunately, however, this is beginning to shift with we have seen a rise in black suicide as of late. But depression and suicide are not white things, they're not black things, they're not Asian things, they are human things. There is strong evidence for a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia. That means if it's in your family, you're more likely to get it. That is true. Okay, so there's a big genetic component to mental illnesses. 26% of adult Americans suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. Yes, true. Most depression, anxiety. Okay, we've got substance abuse disorders and then sleeping disorders. Now, this will kind of be up to you. What is your definition of mentally ill? It changes from person to person, from country to country, and even across time and across generations. How do you prove you are sane if someone accuses you of being mentally ill? Turns out It's kind of hard to do. So we're going to use a couple of ways of defining psychological disorder. The first one is deviance, okay? Behavior, feelings that are outside of what is considered normal. And then deviance is very much culturally defined. This is how the average person probably thinks about mental illness. Are you doing things outside of what is considered normal? Did you come to school with no shoes on? Did you, I don't know, wear a trout as a hat? Okay, oh, he's acting deviantly. Those things he might have a psychological disorder. And if we look at what you are seeing in front of you here, if you've never seen one of these before, this is a standardized set of data. Okay, so within one standard deviation, we look at this for height, I believe, in intelligence, 68% of people, then 95, then 99.7. If you fall outside of those realms, you might be considered deviant. Okay, here are some examples. Most men in the United States are between 5'7", excuse me, 5'6" and 5'11", and then if you're out of that, you're outside of the means. The same for women over here. Okay, SAT scores also follow the same kind of standard deviation plot line, and so do IQ scores. Okay, so most of the population has an IQ between 70 and 130, with very few having anything above that. Now, another way we can define psychological disorder is by distress. Is the person upset by their feelings or behaviors? Okay. The next one is dysfunction. Can the person perform activities like they usually do? Work, school, hygiene, cleaning yourself, etc. Okay. An example of this, it could be someone who does have a problem, but is still functional. We have this term, high functioning alcoholic. So we have people who have alcoholism, they're addicted to alcohol, and it takes over their life. But a lot of people, though, still hold down a job. They still, take care of their family, although not as well. So a lot of people in the US who are alcoholics consider themselves high functioning. It's not really necessarily affecting their life, it's not causing dysfunction. And then the last way we can define it is dangerousness. Is the person at risk of harming themselves or others? So, deviance, outside of the norm, okay? Dysfunction, can't go about your daily life. Distress, causing you mental anguish. And then dangerousness, are you in danger of harming other people? Okay. And one book you guys are going to have to know about is something called the DSM-5. And that means the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. There's obviously been many, many editions. The first one back in 1952. But if you think you have a mental health disorder and you went to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they would take out this book and begin looking through it and say, oh, you have the symptoms of so and so. So this is how people actually diagnose mental illness in the United States today. But the definitions change over time. Okay, so we look at a condition that today we'd call in the general parlance autism. If you look back in time at the first DSM, you had schizophrenia. It was called schizophrenic reaction childhood type. Then they changed it to schizophrenic childhood type schizoid personality. Then infantile autism, then autistic disorder, then autism spectrum disorder. So the names are changing a lot as more information comes in and they reevaluate things. A lot of the insults you may have called someone in elementary school, a moron, an imbecile, an idiot, those are actually old psychological terms that describe how smart someone is. Okay? So those used to be the terms used to describe people, but nowadays they're kind of become insults. We could also see that with the word retarded. That has a medical definition, but it's become unacceptable in modern language to kind of use that term. Now, we've talked in this class a little about historical times, the ancient times. Many people thought mental illnesses were caused by demons, and they'd have treatments like exorcism, starvation, trephination, which is drilling holes in your skull. And we see this in lots of different ancient cultures. In the West, we begin developing asylums or mental institutions in the 14th century. The Arabs were actually a little bit quicker in this than we were. One of the most infamous one of this place called Bedlam in London, and today that word kind of means chaos. And the people were not treated well. They're often treated like animals and kept separate from society. Unfortunately, in some countries around the world today, this is still how they treat the mentally ill, just separate them from the rest of society. Now, we talked about our four things: deviance, distress, dysfunction, and dangerousness. If you are using those four Ds as your criteria, does this person have a psychological disorder? Charlie believes that the noises made by cars and planes going by outside his house have secret meanings. He is convinced that he was involved in the start of a nuclear war, and the only way for him to survive is to find the answer to a difficult riddle. People don't like talking to him because of these thoughts, and he feels lonely. What do you guys think? Is Charlie suffering from a psychological disorder? I would say yes, okay, because people don't like talking to him, these thoughts, and he's feeling lonely. So even though these actions are what we call in common terms crazy, his thoughts, where it's really affecting him is the fact that people don't want to be around him and he's feeling lonely because of it. Charlie more than likely has paranoid schizophrenia. What about Jackie? Jackie frequently talks to herself while she is working on her math homework. Her roommate sometimes hears her and wonders if she is okay. Jackie does not seem to care. Now, Jackie may be doing something unusual, talking out loud, but it's not causing her distress. It's not causing her dysfunction. I don't think she's dangerous, but we don't know that yet. So, excuse me. I would say that Jackie is probably not suffering from a mental disorder. What about Harriet? Harriet gets very depressed during the winter months when the light is low. She sometimes stays in her pajamas for the whole weekend, eating chocolate and watching TV. The last winter, she stopped going to work because her depression got so bad. Harriet is probably suffering from seasonal affective disorder, which is a problem when you're not getting enough vitamin D from sunlight that can lead to a lower production of serotonin and then depression. And we see this last sentence: she stopped going to work. Dysfunction. So it said, yes, Harriet has a psychological disorder. Okay, let's look at Frank. Frank seems to be afraid of a lot of things. He worries about driving the highway and about severe weather that may come through his neighborhood. But mostly he fears mice, checking under his bed frequently to see if any are present. His fears are getting worse and causing him distress. Frank has a psychological disorder because of the fear that it's causing him. All right. Finally, a worshiper speaking in tongues at an evangelical church views himself as filled with the Holy Spirit. It's considered blessed with the gift to speak the language of angels. Now, if you came from the outside, it looks like they're just babbling, but to them, they think it's part of a religious tradition. Does he have a psychological disorder? Probably no. Okay, even though you may not think he's actually speaking to angels, he is doing it in a cultural context that makes sense, and it's not causing him any problems in his life. Okay. Now, we mentioned a little earlier how difficult it can be to prove your own sanity. So I got two quick little stories for you. The first story is about a woman named Nellie Bly, who was a journalist in the late 19th century. And at the time, madhouses, they are called, where they housed the mentally ill, were not very pleasant places to be in. So Miss Bly faked a mental illness and got locked up in a madhouse. Fortunately, she told someone she was going in before time. She witnessed the events that were going on there, and she was greatly disturbed. After 10 days, she wanted to get out and they would not allow her to, but she was able to contact the person she told ahead of time to let them know she was not actually mentally ill. I think there's a Lifetime movie about this as well. And then there was a Stanford psychologist named Dr. Rosenhan who conducted an experiment where he took his students and told them to pretend they had a mental illness and to be admitted to psychiatric hospitals. He then told his students, once they are admitted, to begin acting normally. Even though they acted normally after getting in, none of them were allowed to leave until they agreed to take drugs to fix their problem. Okay. And then Rosenhan afterwards told the hospitals that what had happened and that he'd be sending more people in like this. Afterwards, those hospitals that had been experimented on actually accepted less patients because they weren't convinced if people were truly crazy or not. So it kind of shows the difficulty in figuring out, is someone suffering from mental illness or not. Now, next we're going to look at a couple of causes of the disorder. So we have what we call a biopsychosocial model: biological, psychological, sociological. The first part of it to explain mental illness is the biological. There's some disorders that have a genetic component. Your brain is not producing the right amount of neurotransmitters like serotonin or others as well that can have a negative role on your psyche. Depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, all the major disorders do have genetic components to them. Okay? Another cause could be social. What is considered abnormal or deviant in the culture? How does that person's place in society affect their mental state? Poor people are going to have more mental health disorders than wealthy people, although wealthy people are more likely to be diagnosed because they'll actually seek treatment. In the United States, we do not have a lot of treatment options available for those that are poor. Okay. Now, one thing you're going to read about is kind of some social manias that happened where people started going nuts. And I'm using these terms, generically, and we're not really sure why. You'll look at a dancing mania that occurred in Europe, as well as a laughing mania that occurred more recently in Africa. We also have the psychological, individual mood, personality, and behavior. And this is often reactions to personal circumstances, and past events. So, is it a biological thing? Can we fix it with a pill? Is it a social thing in society that's got to get fixed? Or is it on you? Do we have to help you through therapy or other ways of fixing your ability to cope with the situation? Okay. Now, unfortunately, if you are someone who suffers from mental illness and you're labeled with that, that can become a stigma, okay? And it can affect how others see you. So, a lot of people refuse to seek treatment for their mental illnesses because the fear of stigmas being placed upon them.